Fun fact, there's been a popular meme floating around the internet about two men from Arkansas who were arrested for taking turns shooting each other while wearing a bulletproof vest while drunk. But that's not really what happened. That's only a small part of a story that gets increasingly crazier and crazier. The first man, Charles Ferris, arrived at the hospital late one night complaining about chest pain. When he removed his shirt, the doctors saw a large red bruise on the upper left-hand side of his chest, and when the doctors asked him what had happened, he told them he'd been in a gunfight. The hospital obviously called the police, and when the police got there, they began questioning Charles about the gunfight he'd been in. Charles told them about how he'd been drinking in a bar when a man had approached him saying he needed private security services. Charles said the man paid him $200 to escort him to a secret meeting in the forest, and when they arrived, assailants began shooting at them from hidden positions in the woods. Charles said he was wearing a bulletproof vest and had been hit by a round in the chest, which the vest had stopped. Charles returned fire, shooting back at the assailants in the woods. Charles went on to say as he turned to load his asset back into the car, he was shot 5 more times in the back of his bulletproof vest. Once he and his asset were back in the car, they sped off as Charles continued to fire back at his opponents hiding in the woods. In the end, Charles said he and his asset had managed to escape the gunfight unharmed, but the bullet that had hit him in the chest had left a nasty bruise and he'd come to the hospital to get checked out. Charles asked the police not to call his wife, as he didn't want her to know he was working private security or that he'd been in a gunfight. A short while later, Charles's wife Leslie arrived at the hospital. Police went to talk to her and ask her about Charles's gunfight story. Leslie said that was absolutely not what had happened. Leslie told the police Charles and his neighbor Christopher Hicks had been out back their house drinking together, and for whatever reason Charles was wearing a bulletproof vest. Leslie said after a few beers, Charles convinced Christopher that they should take turns shooting each other while wearing the bulletproof vest. Since Charles was already wearing the bulletproof vest, Christopher went first and shot Charles in the chest with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. The bullet didn't penetrate the vest, but Charles was still pissed off about how much it hurt, even though it had been his idea. It was now Christopher's turn, and he put on the bulletproof vest, and mad about how much his chest hurt, Charles unloaded the 5 remaining rounds in the rifle into Christopher's back, but none of them penetrated the bulletproof vest. After hearing all the gunshots, Leslie went outside to discover the men drunk, playing with a rifle and a bulletproof vest, and told them to cut it out. Later that night, Charles complained to her about how much his chest hurt, and she told him to go to the hospital to get checked out and call her when he got there, but he had never called, so she had come down to the hospital to find him herself. The police went back to speak with Charles, where he admitted he had made up the whole story about protecting a clandestine asset because he didn't want to get his neighbor Christopher into any trouble. Charles was released from the hospital and charged for aggravated assault. The police then went to Charles's home and seized the .22 caliber rifle and the bulletproof vest. The police also went next door and arrested Christopher and charged him with aggravated assault. But Christopher denied the allegations, saying he had never shot Charles, and told the police a completely different story. Christopher told the police, yes, he and Charles had been out back drinking, playing with a bulletproof vest and a .22 caliber rifle, but he said he had not shot Charles. Charles had shot himself. Christopher told the police he had given Charles permission to shoot him in the back while wearing the bulletproof vest, because the gun was a .22 caliber and the vest was steel-plated, so he knew the bullet wouldn't penetrate it. Plus, he had seen Charles, a military veteran, shoot a quarter-sized target 7 times from 50 yards away, so he had no concerns about him missing. After Charles shot Christopher in the back 5 times, Charles told Christopher, okay, now I'll put the bulletproof vest on and you shoot me with the 1 remaining round. Christopher refused, saying he did not want to shoot at Charles even if he was wearing a bulletproof vest. Charles tried to persuade Christopher to shoot him, but Christopher refused. So Charles turned the weapon on himself and shot himself in the chest while wearing the bulletproof vest. And as we all know, he was fine, the bullet didn't penetrate the vest, but it does explain why it hurt so much. The police and prosecutors did not believe Christopher, and no one listened to him, and he was held in Benton County Jail where his arm was broken by a jail deputy. The truth finally came out when Charles later went to the police and admitted he had in fact shot himself in the chest, and Christopher's version of the story was the truth. The police went to question Charles's wife Leslie, who also admitted her version of the story was made up and Christopher was telling the truth. Now, none of this makes sense, I know. Charles made up the first story to keep Christopher out of the story, then Leslie and Charles engineered a second story that highly involved Christopher. None of this makes sense. The charges against Christopher were dropped and he was understandably very pissed off. He had told the truth the entire time, he'd spent time in jail, and he also now had a steel plate, 4 screws, and a metal bracket in his arm, as well as a wire holding his elbow together from the surgery required to fix his arm after the jail deputy had broken it. He was also equally angry about the fact that his name had been dragged through the mud, and he'd been labeled King of the Rednecks by the internet. Charles ended up pleading guilty to aggravated assault and possession of a firearm by a certain person. He was sentenced to 5 years state supervised probation and 27 days in Benton County Jail.